Before we begin our tour through the economy, the environment, and energy, we need to share a common understanding of this thing called money. Money is something that we live with so intimately on a daily basis that it probably has escaped your close attention, which is why we're going to dedicate a few minutes to the subject now. Money is an essential human creation, and were all money to disappear overnight, a new form of money would spontaneously arise in its place, such as cows, tobacco, bread, a certain type of nut husk, perhaps, or even nautilus shells. Today there are other forms of money, such as airline miles and bitcoins, each of which are ways for people to accumulate, store, and then spend other intangible things that behave exactly the same as paper dollars or euros, yen, rubles, or yuan. Without money, the complex job specializations that we have today would not exist because barter is so cumbersome and constraining. More importantly, though, is the concept that each type of money system has its pros and cons. Each will enforce its own peculiar outcomes by promoting some behaviors while punishing others. Now, if we crack open a textbook, we'll find that money should possess three characteristics. The first is that it should be a store of value. Gold and silver filled this role perfectly because they were rare, took a lot of human energy to mine, and did not corrode or rust. By contrast, the US dollar pretty much constantly loses value over time, a feature which punishes savers and enforces the need to speculate and invest. A second feature of money is that it needs to be accepted as a medium of exchange, meaning that it's widely accepted within a population as an intermediary within and across all economic transactions. And the third feature is that money needs to be a unit of account, meaning that the money must be divisible and each unit must be equivalent. The US unit of account is the dollar, and each is identical to any other. Diamonds have much value but are not good at being money because they're not perfectly equivalent to each other, and dividing them causes them to lose value. That is, they fail at being a unit of account. Blah, blah, blah. So what is money really? I believe in a very simple definition. Money is a claim on human labor. With a very few minor exceptions, pretty much anything you can think of that you might spend your money on will involve human labor to bring it there. I say it's a claim on labor rather than a store, because the human labor in question might have happened in the past, or it might not have happened yet. The concept of money being a claim on human labor is important, and we'll be building on it later, especially when we get to debt. As implied in the picture series earlier, literally anything can be considered money. Cows, bread, shells, tobacco. A US dollar, like all modern currencies, however, is an example of a type of money called fiat money. Fiat is a Latin word meaning let it be done. And fiat money has value because a government decrees that it does. And this brings us to the key question: what exactly is a US dollar? Once, a dollar was backed by a known weight of silver or gold of intrinsic value. In this example, we can see that the dollar came from the US Treasury directly and was backed by a given amount of silver that was payable to the bearer on demand. Of course, that was back in the 1930s, and those days are long gone. Now dollars are the liability of the Federal Reserve, a private entity entrusted to manage the U.S. money supply and empowered by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 to perform this vital function. You'll note that modern dollars have no language entitling the bearer to anything, and that's because they are no longer backed by anything tangible. Rather, the value of the dollar comes from this language right here: the fact that it is illegal to refuse to accept dollars for payment, and that they are the only acceptable form of payment for taxes. It is crucially important that a nation's money supply is carefully managed, for if it is not, the monetary unit can be destroyed by inflation. In fact, there are over 3,800 past examples of paper currencies that no longer exist. There are numerous examples from the United States which may have some collector value, such as the greenback, but no longer possess any monetary value. Of course, I could just as easily display beautiful but no longer functional examples from Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, 100 other places. How does a hyperinflationary destruction of a currency happen? Well, here's a relatively recent example that comes from Yugoslavia between the years 1988 and 1995. Pre-1990, the Yugoslavian dinar had immeasurable value. You could actually go out and buy something with one. However, throughout the 1980s, the Yugoslavian government ran a persistent budget deficit and printed money to make up the shortfall. Does this sound familiar? By the early 1990s, the government had used up all its own hard currency reserves, and they proceeded to loot the private accounts of citizens. In order to keep things moving along, successively larger bills had to be printed, finally culminating in this stunning example of a 500 billion dinar note. At its height, inflation in Yugoslavia was running at over 37% per day. This means prices were doubling every 48 hours or so. Let me see if I can make that more concrete for you. Suppose that on January 1, 2007, you had a penny, and you could find something to purchase with it. At 37% per day inflation, by April 3, 2007, you'd need one of these, a $1 billion bill, to purchase the very same item. In reverse, if you'd had $1 billion on January 1st stuffed in a suitcase, by April 3rd, you'd have had a penny's worth of purchasing power left. Clearly, if you'd attempted to save money during this period of time, you'd have lost it all. So we can safely state that inflationary money regimes impose a penalty on savers. The opposite side of this is that inflationary money regimes promote spending and require that money be invested or speculated with so as to at least have the chance of keeping pace with inflation. Of course, investing and speculating involve risks, so we can broaden this statement to include the claim that inflationary monetary systems require the citizens living within them to subject their hard-earned savings to risk. That is worth pondering for a minute or two. Even more importantly, since history shows how common it is for currencies to be mismanaged, we need to keep a careful eye on the stewards of our money to make sure they are not being irresponsible by creating too much money out of thin air and thereby destroying our savings, culture, institutions, our political systems by the process of inflation. Wait a minute. Did I just say creating money out of thin air? Well, yes. Yes, I did. That is such an important process to your, our, my future that we're going to spend the next 2 sections learning how money is created. If you're ready, proceed to the next section. Please join me for Chapter 7. Here, we're going to explore the process by which money is created. Let me introduce you to John Kenneth Galbraith. He taught at Harvard University for many years and was active in politics, serving in the administrations of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson, and among other roles, served as United States Ambassador to India under Kennedy. He was one of a few 2-time recipients of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Clearly a pretty accomplished and stand-up kind of guy. About money, he famously said, "The process by which money is created is so simple that the mind is repelled." What he meant was, even after hearing how money is actually created, you still won't want to believe it. So if you don't get this segment on the first pass, don't worry, because money creation is truly a bizarre thing to ponder, let alone accept. But it's not because it's difficult. Any normal 10-year-old child could understand it. First, let's look at how money is created by banks. Leaving aside for now where this money comes from, suppose a person walks into town with $1,000, and luckily a brand new bank with no deposits has just opened up. The $1,000 is deposited in the bank, and now the person has a $1,000 asset, their bank account, and the bank has a $1,000 liability, the very same bank account. Now, there's a rule on the books, a federal rule, that allows banks to loan out a proportion, a fraction of the money they have on deposit, to other people. In theory, banks are allowed to loan out up to 90% of what people have on deposit with them, although, as we'll see later, the actual proportion is much closer to 100% than 90%. But for our example, we'll use 90%. Regardless of the actual amounts, because banks retain or reserve only a fraction of their deposits, the term for this process is fractional reserve banking. Back to our example. We now have a bank with $1,000 on deposit, and banks do not make money by holding on to it. Rather, they make their living by borrowing at one rate and loaning at a higher rate. Since any bank can loan out up to 90% of any deposits on hand, the bank in our example manages to locate a single individual that wants to borrow $900, and so the bank loans them $900. The borrower then spends that money by giving it to another person, perhaps his accountant, who in turn deposits it in a bank. Now, it could be the same bank or a different bank, but that doesn't really change how the story gets told at all. So let's keep it simple and make it the very same bank. With this new deposit, the bank now has a fresh $900 to work with, and so it gets busy finding somebody who wants to borrow 90% of that amount, or $810. And so another loan, this time for $810, is made, which gets spent and redeposited in the same bank, meaning that a brand new fresh deposit of $810 is available to loan against. So the bank loans out 90% of $810, or $729, and so it goes until we finally discover that the original $1,000 deposit has mushroomed into a total of $10,000. Did you follow that? We went from a stranger ambling into town with $1,000, but now there's $10,000 floating around town. Is this all real money? Oh, you bet it is, especially if it's in your bank account. But if you were paying close attention, you'd realize that what we've actually got here are three things. First, we've got $1,000 held in reserve by the bank, $10,000 in total in various bank accounts, and $9,000 of new debt. The original $1,000 is now entirely held in reserve by the bank, but every new dollar, all 9,000 of them, was loaned into existence and is backed by an equivalent amount of debt. How's your mind doing? Is it repelled yet? You might also notice here that if everybody who had money at the bank, all $10,000 of them, tried to take their money out at once, that the bank would not be able to pay it out because, well, they wouldn't have it. The bank would only have $1,000 hanging around in reserve. Period. You might also notice that this mechanism of creating new money out of new deposits works great as long as nobody defaults on their loan. If and when that happens, things get tricky. If, however, the debt defaults exceed the fractional reserve lending rate, it's a complete disaster. For now, I want you to understand that money is loaned into existence. Conversely, when loans are paid back, money disappears. In our example where our happy little town has $10,000 floating around greasing the skids of commerce, if everyone paid back their loans, the town would have to limp along on just the original $1,000. This is how money is created, and I invite you to verify this for yourself. One place is the Federal Reserve itself, which has published a handy comic book from which I drew this fine example. You can find a link to that on the Peak Prosperity website under Essential Articles. You may have noticed that I left something out that's very important here, and that is interest. You might be asking yourself, wait a minute, where does the money come from to pay all the interest in all these loans? If all the loans are paid back without interest, we can undo the entire string of transactions, but when we factor in interest, there suddenly isn't enough money to pay back all the loans. Clearly, that is a big hole in this story, and so we'll need to find out where that money, the money to pay off the interest, comes from. In doing so, we'll also clear up the mystery of where the original $1,000 came from. So, what was the purpose of all this? Why did we spend these past few minutes studying the mechanism of money creation? Because, in order to appreciate the implications of our massive levels of debt, you have to understand how that debt came into being. That's one reason. And the more important reason is related to all those exponential graphs we viewed earlier in Section 3. But we're not quite there yet. First, we need to travel to the headwaters to find the original source of all money. Where did that original dollars come from in our banking example? To find out, we need to go visit the Federal Reserve, the place where money springs into existence. Please join me for Chapter 8, The Fed. Thank you for listening. Now we're going to travel to the headwaters to discover where money is actually created. The process works like this. Suppose Congress needs more money than it has. I know, that's a stretch. Perhaps it's done something really historically foolish, like cutting taxes while conducting 2 wars at the same time. Now, Congress doesn't actually have any money, so the request for additional spending gets passed over to the Treasury Department. You may be surprised or dismayed, or perhaps neither, to learn that the Treasury Department essentially lives hand-to-mouth and rarely has more than a couple of weeks of cash on hand, if that. So the Treasury Department, in order to raise cash, will print up a stack of Treasury bonds, which are the means by which the U.S. government borrows money. A bond always has a face value, which is the amount it will be sold for, and it has a stated rate of interest that it will pay the holder. So if you bought a bond with $100 of face value and paying a rate of interest of 5%, then you'd pay $100 for this bond, and in a year, you'd get $105 back. Treasury bonds are sold in regularly scheduled auctions, and it is safe to say that the majority of these bonds are bought by big banks and by sovereign nations such as China and Japan. The money that is used to purchase these bonds then gets sent to the Treasury Department's coffers, where it is distributed for the usual array of government programs. I promised you I'd show you how money first comes into being, and so far that hasn't happened, has it? The bonds are being bought with money that already exists. So where does money come from? Money is created by this next mechanism, where the Federal Reserve buys a treasury bond from a bank. If you've been wondering what the so-called quantitative easing, or QE programs are, this next bit describes them. When the Fed buys a bond from a bank or other financial institution, they simply transfer money sufficient to cover the cost of the bond to the other bank, and then they take possession of the bond. It's that simple. A bond is swapped for money. The Fed has the money, the bank has the bond, and they are exchanged. Now, where did the Fed get the money to buy the bond? I'm glad you asked. It literally comes out of thin air as the Fed simply creates money when it buys this bond. Such newly created Fed money is always exchanged for a debt instrument, be that a treasury bond, a mortgage-backed security or MBS paper, or even corporate debt on rare occasions. So we can now put the title on this page. Don't believe me? Here's a quote from a Federal Reserve publication entitled "Putting It Simply." When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover the check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. Wow, that is an extraordinary power. Whereas you or I need to work to obtain money and place it at risk in the markets to have it grow, the Federal Reserve simply prints up as much as it wishes, whenever it wants, and then loans it all to us via the U.S. government, with interest. Given the fact that over 3,800 paper currencies, and a few metallic ones, have been rendered worthless due to mismanagement, wouldn't it make sense to keep a very close eye on whether or not the Federal Reserve is acting responsibly with our own monetary unit? What if they're overdoing it and printing too much? Because this is such an extraordinary power to have, we really should pay close attention to what they're up to. Alright, so now we know that there are two kinds of money out there. The first is bank credit, which is money that is loaned into existence, as we saw before. Bank credit is a type of money that comes with an equal and offsetting amount of debt associated with it, debt upon which interest must be paid. The second type of money is printed out of thin air, and that's what we see here at this stage. The process by which money is created is so simple that the mind is repelled, so don't worry if you need to review this chapter several more times. I've had some people tell me that they've reviewed this section 4 or more times before it really began to sink in. However, if you understood all that and get it, congratulations. Give yourself a hand, because it's not easy. These monetary learnings allow us to formulate two more extremely important key concepts. The first is that all dollars are backed by debt. At the local bank level, all new money is loaned into existence. At the Federal Reserve level, money is simply manufactured out of thin air and then mostly exchanged for interest-paying government debt. In both cases, the money is backed by debt. Debt that, of course, pays interest. From this key concept, we can formulate a truly profound statement, which is that, at a minimum, each year enough new money must be loaned into existence to cover the interest payments on all of the past outstanding debt. If we flip this slightly, we can say that each year all the outstanding debt must compound by at least the rate of the interest on that debt. Each and every year it must grow by some percentage. Because our debt-based money system is growing by some percentage over time, it is an exponential system by its very design. A corollary of this brings us to our second key concept, which is that the amount of debt in the system will always exceed the amount of money in the system. So, if there's always more debt in the system than money, and the interest to pay off the debt must be loaned into existence, well, that too deserves at least a few minutes of your careful attention. It's not my role here to cast judgment on the system and to say if it's good or if it's bad. It simply is what it is. By understanding its design, though, you will be better equipped to understand that the potential range of future outcomes for our economy are not limitless, but rather bounded by the rules of the system. And that system is one that is designed to increase by some percentage, in this case the rate of interest on all the outstanding debt, over time, at a minimum. That is, our money system is designed to expand exponentially. That is a feature of our money system. Whether we happen to believe this is a good thing or a bad thing does not change the fact that this is simply how our money system is designed. All of which leads us to another key concept, which is that perpetual expansion is a requirement of modern banking. Not a legal requirement, but a systemic requirement, like your body as a system requires oxygen. In fact, we can make a rule. To avoid cascading disruption, each year new credit or loans must be made that at least equal the amount of all the outstanding interest payments that year. Without a continuous expansion of the money supply, past debts would not be able to be serviced, and defaults would ripple through and possibly ruin the entire system. Defaults are the Achilles heel of a debt-based money system, which we saw in our local banking example in the previous chapter. Because of this, all the institution and political forces in our society are geared towards avoiding this very outcome. So the banking system must continually expand, not necessarily because it's the right or wrong thing to do or because some law requires it, but rather simply because that's how it was designed. Continual expansion is a feature of the system, just like using gasoline is a feature of my car's engine. I might wish and hope that my car would run on straw or water, but I'd be wasting my time because that's just not how it was designed. By understanding the requirement for continual expansion, we are in a better position to assess whether that's even possible, and if we think that it's not, then we're free to imagine what might come next. I personally have my doubts about the long-term viability of a system that must expand exponentially forever, but which ultimately lays claim to the resources of a finite planet. So the question is this: what happens when a human-contrived money system that must expand by its very design runs headlong into the physical limits of a spherical planet that has only so much to offer? Someday, sooner or later, our monetary and economic models will collide with physical realities. One more belief I happen to hold is that I will witness this collision in my adult lifetime, and in fact, it has already started. And I am extremely interested to see how this is all going to turn out. Now, this is, admittedly, a truly gigantic proposition to consider, and some would say it's not very interesting at all, but rather frightening. Well, if you want the future to look just like the past, then it really is frightening. But if you are flexible in your view of the future, then you have an opportunity to make the most of whatever future actually arrives. These are fascinating, invigorating, and truly unprecedented times, and I, for one, am thrilled to be living right now, right here, with you. In the next section, we'll be looking at some very important historical context about our money system, where you'll learn that our money system could be viewed as a masterpiece of sophisticated evolution, or as a historically brief experiment that's just a bit over 40 years old. In order to better appreciate just how remarkable this all truly is, please join me for Chapter 9, A Very Brief History of U.S. Money. Thank you for listening.